Hi guys, Mr. Lead here. Today we're going to be looking at the topic of cells. We've already looked at microscopes, the tool we need to look at cells. Now we're going to understand more about cells themselves. Cells are the building blocks of life. Now we'll come back to what all this means in a moment. First, in this lesson, hopefully you should understand by the end of this lesson, you'll know what cell theory is. You should be able to classify and know how to classify animals, plants, and fungi. Based on cells. You should also start to understand what organelles are, and you'll also know how cells divide. All of this is going to make sense in a moment. By the way, during this lesson, make sure you're taking down notes and filling in the blanks in your PowerPoint sheets. If you can't keep up, there is a copy of these slides on Sector. Okay, first things first. What is cell theory? So to understand this, we need to know a little bit about the history of microbiology. So I mentioned it previously that microbiology started off with a famous scientist named Antoine van Leeuwenhoek. Now, van Leeuwenhoek was one of the first guys to use a microscope to actually see microbes, but it wasn't until Robert Hooke, the guy who he was famous for making very beautiful pictures of microscopic things like fleas and ants and just blowing everyone's minds in that day and age. Robert Hooke was the first guy to actually see and name cells. He looked at different pieces of plants, or he looked at a slice of cork more specifically, and he saw all these little boxes in the cork. And he called them cells because they reminded him of little monks living in their own little rooms, cooped up in one big building, like little cells. So it wasn't until 1831, that's almost 200 years later, that a scientist named Robert Brown saw a little dot in the middle of a bunch of cells. And this dot was the nucleus. So here's a timeline of discoveries of microbiology. Like I said, it was in the late 1600s that we first discovered cells, but it wasn't until over 100 years later, almost 200 years later, that we started to understand what cells were. That's incredible. That's a massive amount of time. So much time where there was no progress made in microbiology. Perhaps today there is like some field of science where there could have been just an easy second step, made, but no one's making any progress. So understand, prior to the 1830s, no one realized what cells were. People just thought our skin is just made of skin, and our body is just made of whatever our body is made up of. Whereas in reality, we understand now that our skin and our body and everything in our body are made of cells. Cells are basically like, if you imagine our body to be completely made of Lego, each cell is like a different Lego block. And they are so small on the microscopic level that once you put them all together, you get an organ or a piece of tissue, like an organ like your skin. So people started working out a few key ideas to cells. They worked out these three key ideas. Firstly, all living creatures are made of one or more cells, and all living things are composed of cells. And thirdly, new cells come from existing ones. So you don't have life just randomly appearing, which sounds obvious. Yeah, of course we don't have life randomly appearing. But 200 years ago, people didn't realize this. This was mind-blowing. People just thought that things like maggots, people thought they just appeared out of nowhere. And it wasn't until 200 years ago that we started realizing, oh, mold, that actually comes from other mold. And maggots, they come from eggs, obviously. Yeah, so that's cell theory. Now, when we look at different organisms on the microscopic level, we see that the very cells, the little building blocks that they're made of, actually differ from each other. An animal differs to a plant because of their cells, not because of everything else, mostly because of the cells. So this is an example of an animal cell. the key things that an animal cell will be composed of is organelles, cytoplasm, and the plasma membrane. Okay, so going through these one by one. The plasma membrane, that's just the outside of the cell. That's just, imagine like comparing it to our body. It's like the skin of the cell. It's the outside. The cytoplasm is the jelly stuff in the middle. It's the jelly stuff that's just kind of like holding and giving the cell some structure. And organelles are the cell's little tiny organs. So yeah, an organelle literally just means a small organ. And there are so many different types of organelles. We're actually going to learn these different types of organelles. And by the end of this topic, you should actually read the name of this organelle, and you should actually know what it does. Now, here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We got nine of the main organelles. There's a few others we're going to learn. These are 9 of the main ones. And like I said, you're going to know the function of every single one of these. But I'm not going to, right now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about them. A lot of them are pretty intuitive. A lot of them are kind of like have counterparts that are kind of similar to our own bodies, like on the larger level. So say, for example, the vacuole, it's like a storage space. It's kind of like a stomach. We got the mitochondria, which gives energy to the cell. Now, again, we're going to go into this in more depth in a future lesson. Just know that there's a stack of organelles. You can start learning what they are now, but we're going to learn, by the end of this topic, we'll know what all of these are. Okay. You also know them to the degree where if you saw an image of a cell, you'd be able to point at one of these little shapes here and say, oh, I know that. That's the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Well, I know that. That's the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. All right. Now, plant cells. The way that plant cells differ from animal cells is a few things. Firstly, plant cells have different sets of organelles. So this was the set of organelles. These are the organelles you normally find in animals. You find similar organelles in a plant, but there's a few differences. For example, the vacuole. I briefly mentioned the vacuole before. Vacuole is basically like the storage organelle. It's all about storing things. In the animal cell, you do get a vacuole, but usually they're very small. They don't need to store much. In plants need to store a lot more things. They need to store water, nutrients, mostly water. So their vacuoles are going to be much bigger. Plants also have, like animals, plants have what's called a cell membrane. That's so I mentioned that before. That's like the skin of the cell. But plants have another layer outside that cell membrane. So imagine this is the cell membrane. Plants also have a cell wall. 2 layers are outside the cell. And these cell walls are really rigid. Cell membranes, they can be squished around. Cell walls, they're rigid. They act as like a really tough skeleton for the plant. And they're made of cellulose. And lastly, plant cells have something called chloroplasts. Because what do plants do that animals can't do? Plants can photosynthesize. And they can photosynthesize, that's get energy from the sun, because of chloroplasts. These chloroplasts are special little organelles inside the cells that know how to photosynthesize, know how to convert sunlight into glucose. And they contain something called chlorophyll. We'll go into more depth. We'll reflect on this further later in the topic. By the end, you'll understand. You'll just know all these words by the back of your hand. Lastly, fungi cells. Fungi are kind of like a cross between a plant and an animal cell. Specifically, something unique about fungi, they can be either unicellular or multicellular. Those words mean what they sound they mean. Unicellular means a fungi cell can be you can have just one fungi cell, and that's it. That's the entire animal. Oh, sorry, that's the entire fungi. Or you can have fungi cells that are multicellular, like a mushroom or something, and that's an entire organism. And some other differences: fungi cells have a cell wall, just like plant cells, but their cell wall is made of something different. It's made of something called chitin, not cellulose. But unlike plant cells, they don't have chloroplasts. So eventually, if I were to show you a picture of either a plant, animal, or fungi cell, you would hopefully, just by looking at the picture alone and no descriptions or anything, you'd be able to tell me, oh, that's a plant cell, or oh, that's an animal cell. That's the point where I'd hope you to get to with this topic. Here's some questions that I would like you to ponder. Why does a plant need that rigid shape? Why does a plant need those cell walls while an animal doesn't? And why does an animal need to have a squishy shape? Some things to ponder. Okay, lastly, now plants, animals, and fungi are not the only types of organisms. We've also got microscopic organisms, unicellular organisms. Unicellular, remember that means one cell. So for example, bacteria. Bacteria is an example of an organism that just live as one cell. Us, we're big. We're made of lots of cells. Bacteria, one cell, that's all the organism is. Unicellular organisms are usually found in aquatic environments, usually in like pond water. You're going to find so millions of different species in just one little puddle. And they can cause disease, which is why it's always important to boil your water before drinking from it. When getting water from a river or something. All right, the last thing I would like you guys to learn and understand is how is it that we get more cells? Like I said, cells don't just spontaneously appear like people thought 200 years ago. They come from other cells. So you might see in cartoons of do this before. One cell will divide into two. That's how cells reproduce. Now, this reproduction is called mitosis. That's a word I want you to remember, mitosis. And so we're going to see your body is constantly, cells are just constantly experiencing mitosis all the time to grow things, to repair things. When you've got a scab that is being repaired, you're seeing mitosis happening there. When you got like muscles that are being muscle cells that have died, you've got new muscle cells appearing in their place. Mitosis is happening every second in your body. It happens all the time. If you want a cheesy way to remember what the word mitosis is, here's a joke. What did the cells say to his sister when she stepped on his toe? My toe, sis. There you go, guys. All right, there should be some style questions for you guys to do this lesson. And the next period, hopefully you get to actually start using microscopes. Thanks for watching, guys.